So you've got equity sitting in a buy-to-let, but you can't access it. That's a problem. And it's a common conversation I have with property investors that already own one buy-to-let, but don't know how to access the equity to buy the second or third property. Nearly 4 in 10 landlords are planning on refinancing their property in the next 12 months to buy more investment property. But most people on their first or second property don't actually understand what lenders are looking for and what their requirements are to actually release this equity. In this video, I'll show you exactly how this process works, what the 2 tests are that your property needs to clear, and I'll walk you through a real case study of a client that I've worked with personally who released equity from their first investment property to purchase 3 more to hit their long-term goals. His numbers are definitely worth seeing if you're in this stage right now and you want to scale a long-term portfolio. If you're new here, welcome. My name's James. I'm the co-founder and managing director of a property investment consultancy called Frater Property Partners. We help time-poor professionals invest in property across the Midlands, Yorkshire and the Northwest, but this channel is all about your education. Before anything else, it's worth being clear on what a remortgage or a refinance actually means, because it gets used loosely on a day-to-day basis. A remortgage on a buy-to-let property is simply replacing the current mortgage you have on that with a new loan from a new or the same lender. You're not selling the property, you're not moving into it, you're releasing equity. Basically, you're asking a lender to reassess the value of the property in the current market and then loan against that current value. There's 2 reasons why most buy-to-let investors do this. First is to get a better rate on their mortgage if mortgage rates have changed since the last time they fixed their mortgage. And the second is exactly what we're focused on, to release equity. Essentially, we're going to pull out some of the capital growth that we've seen while owning that property to use that as down payments for further property investment. Basically, the difference between your old mortgage and your new one is the equity you have to play with for your next investment. That cash could be used as a down payment on one property, but depending on how much you're able to release, that could be multiple properties you're able to get with that released equity. It's not magic. You are increasing your debt on your property portfolio, but you're accessing cash that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. This released equity then it generates an income and gives you the opportunity to leverage again and benefit from more properties that are leveraged, that are growing in value over time. It allows you to use the maths to your advantage, and it's something that I'll show you in the case study section. The question I get asked most by beginner property investors is, why don't I just sell the property and I have a bigger pot of cash so that I can then invest elsewhere? And the answer is pretty straightforward. Selling costs you money and you're going to have to pay tax on any of the profit that you've made from the sale of that property. On top of that, you've then got estate agent fees and legal costs, and then you completely lose any income that property was producing because you don't own it anymore. And obviously that's on top of not seeing any more capital growth for that property because, again, you don't own it anymore. Remortgaging is a much simpler way. It allows you to keep the property, keep the tenant, and benefit from the long-term prospects of that property while releasing money in a tax-efficient way. You're essentially having your cake and eating it. Another reason investors often remortgage rather than selling the property is because you often get your hands on the cash a lot faster. If your target is to build a property portfolio of 4, 5 or 6 properties in the long term, selling one to fund the next means you're constantly fighting this battle and you're not actually able to scale in the way that you're looking to. Remortgaging gives you the opportunity to scale without shrinking your portfolio, and you'll start to see the economies of scale over time. So far, it all sounds great. Refinance and scale the portfolio. However, this only works if the numbers back it. And this brings us to the 2 tests that every single lender will have to make sure that you pass before they're willing to lend on that property again. Test 1, LTV. LTV stands for loan to value and is essentially the amount of the property you actually own. So if you have a 75% loan to value on the property, you own 25% of that overall asset. Most lenders actually cap the LTV at around 75% in the current market. So if you see people talking about getting 80% loan to value, the likelihood is it's very rare, and if they can get it, it's very expensive. This means that you need an absolute minimum of 25% in the property for a lender to even consider a remortgage. So, for example, if your property is worth £280,000 in 2026, the maximum most lenders will offer is 210k on that property. So if your current mortgage is 150k, you'll be able to release around 60k to then invest in future properties. So before you look at refinancing, you need to first look at the amount of equity you have in the portfolio and your loan to value. The second test is a test that actually catches out a lot more informed and experienced property investors, which is the ICR stress test. ICR stands for interest coverage ratio, and lenders use it to make sure that the rental income on the property will always cover the mortgage costs, so it's not coming out of your back pocket as a property investor. The difficulty with this is they don't just test it based on today's interest rate, they stress test changing interest rates to make sure that even if interest rates change in the next few years, that property will still cash flow positively and that mortgage is going to be paid every single month. So here's how it works in practice in 2026. Most lenders will often stress test the property at around 5.5%. So even if your actual mortgage rate is a lot lower than that, they'll stress test at this slightly higher figure. What they'll then do is then stress test against changing interest rates of around 125 to 145% of this rate. For most investors buying through limited companies, which obviously most investors are doing nowadays, it's around 125%. But if you are looking at buying through your personal name and you're a high taxpayer, which I'd usually recommend against, although I'm not a tax accountant, then you're likely to have the highest stress test to make sure that property is still going to cash flow positively, even with dramatically worse interest rates. Let me give you an example. So you want to remortgage and release equity, and your new mortgage on that property is going to be 180k. At a stress test with a 5.5% interest rate on that mortgage, you're going to be looking in and around £9,900 per year, divided by 12, which is £825 per month. Your rent then needs to cover 125% of this figure. This is £1,031 per month, so your rent has to be higher than this figure. This is why the rental yield on your property matters in the current day, even if you don't need the income immediately. A low yielding property in an area that is quite expensive might have a lot of equity in that property that you might not actually be able to access because of these stress tests. If you're getting a yield of somewhere between 5 and 7% on that property, then these stress tests are usually pretty straightforward. But again, when you're refinancing these properties, you need to make sure that you know your numbers and it will still work. So you've worked out your LTV, you've done the numbers in terms of the rental figures, and it all stacks up. So what does this process actually look like from here? Step 1, speak to a whole of market mortgage broker. Don't go to your bank and don't go to the lender you currently have your mortgage with yet. A whole of market broker has access to exactly that, the whole market of possible lenders you could have on that property. Different lenders often have different ICR thresholds, and depending on the time of year, they'll have different criteria and different appetites to lending on certain properties. A good broker will match you with the right lender before you submit your application. This saves you time and money. Step 2 is the agreement in principle. Once the broker has identified the right lender for you, they'll get you an agreement in principle. This is a soft confirmation of how much the lender is actually willing to lend you on this property. It's not legally binding, but it does give you an idea of a ballpark figure and whether it actually makes sense to go through with the full application. Step 3 is exactly that, the full application. This is where you submit everything. The lender will want proof of rental income, your current mortgage details, and bank statements. For portfolio landlords, they'll want an idea of the full portfolio within the property, but the likelihood is, if you're watching this, that's probably not you quite yet. To make sure everything moves smoothly, just make sure you get all of these documents together as soon as you can. Step 4, valuation. This is where someone will come and value the property. If it's a straightforward remortgage without releasing equity, this is usually just a desktop valuation. But if you are looking to take out a chunk of equity from your property, the likelihood is someone will come out and value it in person. For this part, make sure you budget 1 to 2 weeks because people aren't always available immediately when you need them. Step 5 is mortgage offer. Once the underwriting and the valuation has taken place, you'll then get a formal mortgage offer at the new value that the property is now been valued at. Read it carefully, confirm the rate, the term, the amount that you're actually getting, and finally, if there's any early repayment charges on that loan. And then finally, step 6, conveyancing and completion. A conveyancer then handles the legal side of things. This is the boring bit, but often very important. And then this stage typically takes between 2 and 4 weeks. So there's the process from start to finish. And although we've talked about some slight time frames, we'll go into detail about that a little bit further down the line, because it's not always as straightforward as just that. So let me show you how this actually plays out. And I'll give you an example of one of the clients that I've worked with in the past when they released equity from their property in Leeds. I've anonymized their details and changed it a little bit, but the numbers are all exactly the same, so you can be confident on how that works. The investor came to me with one buy-to-let property that he had owned for a number of years when he was working overseas and earning quite a lot of money in a previous job. He bought it 10 years earlier for 200k and put down quite a healthy deposit on that property. The cash flow was reasonable, but by the time we sat down, the property was actually worth 300k and he had about 60k left on his mortgage. His problem was pretty straightforward. The income from one property was okay while he was working, but if he ever wanted to step away from work or step down to part-time, this wouldn't be enough. His target was to get himself in a position where he could earn enough from his property portfolio so he could step down from his day job. The fastest way to get there that we identified was to first grow his equity and then focus on the income once we hit that target. Because he wanted to do this within the 5-year period, that one property was definitely not enough. So what we did is we ran the numbers at a 75% loan to value on a 300k property. The maximum mortgage was 225k, but once he redeemed the 60k mortgage he previously had on that property, we had around 200k to release for future property investment. So we had nearly 200k cash to then invest in property from just refinancing an asset that he's owned for a long time that wasn't actually getting him a load of income. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We use that money for down payments on 3 more properties priced somewhere between 180 and 200k. We targeted Yorkshire and the Northwest because he was based in Yorkshire and it performed well, and the Northwest was an area which should have seen really strong growth moving forward. Each property we purchased with a 10% discount, so we got immediate equity at the point of purchase to make it easier if and when he chose to refinance in a few years' time. Meaning that if he was buying a property worth 200k, he was actually buying it for £180,000, which means that he needed less cash every time he bought a property. This scenario just played out 3 times with slightly different purchase prices each time to make sure that we weren't going over this 200k mark with all fees included. In short, his net income from the 4 properties didn't actually increase much from the 1 property that he already owned because he had mortgages on the assets. The thing to remember though, that income is not the important factor immediately. The income will be important in 5 years' time. The idea is that we now have 4 properties in total worth about 900k that are all growing in value in areas primed for long-term growth and obviously are leveraged. Assuming capital growth of anywhere from 4 to 6% annually, he'd have the opportunity to scale his portfolio and grow his equity within his portfolio somewhere in the region of £550,000 to £600,000. That got him to his number, and then the plan shifts to then focus on income. The plan is, at that point, is then to reduce the size of the portfolio. We'll sell 1 or 2 of these properties. We'll use that cash to pay off the debt on the remaining part of the portfolio, and that will give us the income that we're looking for. Basically, staying put with 1 property was the low return option. He could have waited 10 or 15 years to get to this goal with just 1 property, but we went a little bit more aggressively through refinancing, scaling, and then releasing equity further down the line. The way I look at it is like a tech company. When a tech company grows in the early stages, they're not focused on profitability. They're focused on growth, and then once they hit that target of growth that they're aiming for, they then focus on becoming profitable. The beauty within property is you are always going to be profitable with any buy-to-let that you look at from that perspective. However, we should still focus on the growth in the early days, and then we can focus on the income further down the line. The one thing I want to flag before you start this process is almost every broker will tell you the timelines involved in refinancing and releasing equity is around 4 to 6 weeks, but it's often quite a bit longer than that. If you're remortgaging to release equity or you're switching lenders, the likelihood is you're going to be somewhere between 6 to 12 weeks rather than this 4 to 6. The conveyancing process alone takes several weeks, and this is if the conveyance has actually moved to a reasonable time frame. And if the existing lender is slow with producing the redemption statement, which can often happen because they're not particularly bothered about moving quickly, you can always add a couple of weeks on top for that as well. So what you need to do is make sure you start this process early. If you know that you've got equity in there and you know it will pass its tests, start the process before your fixed term comes to an end. And please use a whole of market broker. Don't just go to your closest lender or your bank because it's easy. So let's pull this all together. Remortgaging a buy-to-let property to release equity for further property investment is one of the best tools you have as a property investor. The two things you need to get right is the LTV and the ICR ratio. Make sure you speak to an all of market broker so you're doing the right thing and looking at all of your options for lending. Focus on an end goal and make sure you're doing it for a reason, not just because you think it's the right thing to do. And if you've got a property that you're looking at potentially refinancing and you're not sure on where to deploy that money or what to do with it, then I'll put a link to our website, Frater Property Partners, in the description. You can have a free chat with one of the team to see if we have anything that might work for you. This will depend on exactly what you're looking for and where you're looking to purchase, but we help people buy properties across the Midlands, Yorkshire and the Northwest, so we might have something that could work for you and your portfolio. And if not to worry, hopefully we can point you in the right direction to someone that might be able to help you with you and your specific goals. If this has been useful, then please subscribe to the channel. In the next couple of weeks, I'm also putting together a buy-to-let versus buy refurb refinance challenge to see which strategy is the best for each specific investor and their situations. So if you're deciding between the two strategies, then that's one that's definitely going to be worth watching. But thanks again. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.